Many of you will have seen our coverage earlier this week of the media's masterclass in manipulation over football hooliganism in Amsterdam. Our report laid bare how outlet after outlet twisted the truth to fit a narrative that served Israel. Did we get reports on Israeli football fans chanting genocidal and racist slogans, burning Palestinian flags, and generally causing chaos in Amsterdam before the city clapped back? No. We got news that conformed to the hasty conclusions of Western leaders, pogroms, and purely anti-Semitic attacks. Now, this is hardly the first time the media have turned themselves into a weapon in Israel's war on Gaza. In fact, right from the beginning, Western outlets from the BBC to CNN and from The Guardian to the New York Times have made themselves complicit in the murder of tens of thousands of Palestinians. And they've done this in three important ways, starting as soon as Israel's assault began. First, they've concealed important context from their audiences. After October the 7th, the media repeatedly asked this question.
Do you condemn what Hamas did?
Do you support what Hamas launched?
Will you now take the opportunity to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th?
Though you cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you?
Now, that question served to frame anyone who was trying to contextualize the day or raise concerns about Israel's response as illegitimate. This was an attempt to silence any speaker sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, including almost every Palestinian invited on air, by casting them as suspicious. And the question effectively erased discussion of Israel's oppression and occupation of the Palestinians from public view right from the start. And when Palestinians did try to talk about history, they were misrepresented. Here's one striking example. On the 10th of October last year, Sky's Kay Burley more than once accused Hussam Zomlot, Palestinian ambassador to the UK, of saying of October 7th that Israel had it coming.
The Palestinian ambassador basically said the last couple of days that Israel had it coming. This is an atrocious comment by the Palestinian ambassador to the UK.
What Zomlot actually said was, Israel knew this was coming their way. Sky later apologized.
Now, on Sky News Breakfast early this month, we reported that the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Hussam Zomlot, said in reference to the Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October that Israel had it coming. We recognise that this was not what Dr. Zomlot had said in an earlier interview.
So they apologized, but do you see the trick? Second, instead of providing context to Israel's war, the media has preferred fiction.
Babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said.
The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
I really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
Time and time again, journalists failed to challenge Israel's assertions. Another example, they repeatedly allowed Israeli officials to broadcast the myth of the country's precise military operations in Gaza without scrutiny. Meanwhile, claims of widespread systematic sexual assault on 7th of October continue to be stated as fact, and that's despite many of the sources of those claims proving to be unreliable. Third, Palestinians have been constantly dehumanized and their political aims and aspirations erased. Instead, Palestinians have been cast as either terrorists or victims of a humanitarian disaster. That's a binary that erases the notion of Palestinian resistance from the public conversation. And that binary also benefits Israel. If Palestinians are all terrorists, then they can be killed without accountability. And if they're just the victims of a humanitarian disaster, no one needs to worry about the causes of this blameless natural crisis. Either way, media outlets can avoid speaking about who killed Palestinians when they simply die in their thousands.
In Gaza, Hamas officials say at least 700 people have been killed.
More than 1,400 people have been killed.
50 children have been killed in 48 hours in Jabalia in northern Gaza.
The war in Gaza continues with significant civilian casualties.
Instead of calling for the bombs to stop, the media can focus on calling for aid to get in. And instead of exposing the causes of this genocide, the media can adopt the much more comfortable frame of an inexplicable disaster. So why have Western audiences lapped up this false framing? That's easy. They've long been conditioned to view events involving the Middle East through racist, Islamophobic narratives. For at least the last 23 years, the war on terror has been the lazy and simplifying lens through which countries like the US and its allies have justified all manner of violence.
And rid the world of thousands of terrorists and freed a country from brutal oppression. We are winning the war on terror.
This fake war on terror stamp on the Arab world has created false contrasts between terrorists and victims, between barbaric chaos and liberal order. It's erased all distinctions between different groups of rebellious Muslims. It's merged resistance with insurgents, conflated independence movements with Islamist imperialist projects, positioning all as a threat to Western democracy. Here's a fact. On October 7th last year, every journalist in every newsroom in the West knew exactly what Israel would do to Gaza. What's been lacking isn't knowledge, they all had it, but the moral courage to report the truth. Because it takes courage to report honestly on a genocide, and courage to reveal the Western complicity required to make it possible. And it takes even more courage to cut a clear path through a colonial history of abuse and occupation that Western audiences have long been trained to ignore and reject. Helena, it's been over 400 days since the war on Gaza began, since the genocide began. Have you seen any improvement in the media coverage of the genocide since then?
There have been certain improvements that I've seen from some places. Now, it's been patchy where you get the good coverage from. I think obviously some outlets are better than others. For example, I've been far more impressed with, I've seen reporting from places like Channel 4 than I have from places like the BBC, for example. It's definitely patchy in terms of where you get the coverage from. What's interesting, I find that the nature at which, even if the underlying assumptions haven't gone away, that the level of bias hasn't changed, or indeed that the framing, in that the lopsided framing hasn't really changed over the last 400 days. What has changed is the level to which plausible deniability is even possible at any point, right? We've mentioned a lot on our show about how no matter what the mainstream media report, we can all go on our phones. We can all see on our social media feeds what's happening to Gazans, the testimonies of people who are not necessarily covered by the mainstream media, discussing what has been going on in Gaza, whether or not they are Gazans themselves, or whether or not they are aid workers giving their own testimony on what's been happening within the occupied territories, right? There has been plenty of coverage outside of mainstream media. So for the entirety of the period where they've tried to have this lens of plausible deniability, that doesn't exist anymore. That's stopped now. What they have now got is they have this level to which that they try and present things without making any distinction, and then allowing people who've already been primed through the previous framing to continue viewing it through that, even though most of us have already seen the reality, again, with what we've seen on our social media feeds. So it's difficult. It's difficult for them to be able to play that game any longer. I think it's very interesting that the narrative of East versus West has been what you say in your piece there, Stephen. That's been very pervasive, not just in terms of with the media reporting it, but the ways in which in interviews with Western media, Israeli politicians have explicitly done that as well. You remember the Hasbara narrative that we saw right at the start of this conflict, where they said, well, Hamas is ISIS, when they're completely different in terms of their overall outlook. Again, trying to talk about Hamas as if they aren't a Palestinian nationalist movement, right? You can critique, you can criticize, and you can oppose their methods, you can oppose their beliefs, you can oppose their ideology all that you want. But to mischaracterize them as being Islamist first and foremost, and then Palestinian nationalist second, that is a big misstep in terms of an accurate reporting of the reasons for why we have this conflict in the first place. The reason why Hamas exists as an entity is because of the material conditions of the Palestinian people, right? They are part of the synthesis between we've seen the conflict since 1967. They would not exist were it not for the occupation. That is something that is based in the conditions that that is based on the conditions that the Palestinian people have been subjected to for the last for over half a century. So that framing of trying to get people in the West to see them as people who are just there as part of a broader movement to establish a caliphate rather than to reclaim their own territory that they had been ethnically cleansed from during the Nakba is again, it underlies the lack of reporting that we've seen broadly since 1948 to educate Western audiences on the realities of the Israel-Palestine conflict ever since 1948. Because you can remember as well that it'll be very tempting. It's very tempting for a lot of people to look at this very biased coverage, to look at what we've seen as being a narrative that is very pervasive throughout a lot of our mainstream media in the West, and to try and imply that there's somebody in the halls of power of our media who's getting people to report things in a biased manner. And we have seen things like documents about acceptable language, for example. I forget which American news media organization it was. Well, you can't say genocide, you can't say occupation, you can't say any of these words that might lend people to understand the reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict. You can't say those things because then people would have their assumptions challenged. But what this is more of is an example of manufactured consent. It's nothing to do with people saying things that they know are untrue. It's not people manipulating bad data deliberately. This is a case of ideological groupthink. This is people who are already part of these assumptions before they come into the newsrooms themselves. In the wise words of Noam Chomsky, I fully believe that you are sincere in everything that you personally believe. But if you believed anything different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting right now in terms of the mainstream media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the New York Times that you were referring to when you were talking about the editorial guidelines, not using the term genocide. And I was thinking of the term Holocaust because, of course, we recently published a piece by a Palestinian writer who wanted to use the word Holocaust to describe the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And The Guardian said no. And so she came to us and we did publish it and we did use that word. And I think that was something that we should be very proud of as an organization. One of the things that strikes me so much about the coverage is that, it's sometimes, mainstream media does things that are good. You can't deny it. So, for example, Sky last night did a very compelling report, very disturbing report, in fact, on the killing in an Israeli jail of one of Gaza's most esteemed surgeons. And it focused in on the individual case, the brutality that this man suffered at the hands of Israeli soldiers and then Israeli jailers. And then, of course, you get a zooming out that it does where it talks about, quite vague terms, what is happening in Gaza. So you get these sort of individual stories being told, which are very important stories to tell. And you get, sometimes interviews with people talking about how many times they've had to move, which is a very, very important story to tell. But you never get the joining of the dots that says, okay, well, there is a phenomenon that's happening here, and it has a word, genocide. So few mainstream outlets are prepared to even entertain that word. And I think the UN today has just come out and they've said something about meeting the conditions for genocide, potentially meeting the conditions for genocide. And I wonder if that, I don't think it will because, the ICJ has already, used the word genocide. It hasn't said that Israel is committing a genocide, but it's nonetheless associated that word with Israel in laying in making an order about what Israel was supposed to do, which has been widely ignored. I wonder if maybe it's not going to make a difference, but do you think these international bodies increasingly being comfortable with the use of that word is at some point going to tip the media in that direction, or will they just resist it completely?
I think they will probably resist it until they have the time to do so. I wish I could go back in time to the 90s and see how people reported on the Yugoslav wars and what happened in Bosnia. What we know now, obviously, it took decades of litigation to be able to determine at least partly of which of that was a genocide in legal terms. I don't know how it was referred to before those conditions were met and whether or not that changed people's viewpoints in terms of international organizations commenting on it beforehand. I don't know, but I'd be interested to see. I think that just like most organizations that don't have there's no interest in them in taking a very forceful line on this. They'll probably still want to make things at least similar, as neutral as possible in their regard. What I find interesting obviously you said you obviously had the word Holocaust in your mind, right? This is a word that Ronald Reagan used to describe the intervention or the invasion of Lebanon by Israel in the 1980s, right? So to say that it's beyond the pale to be thinking of these words in terms only when the American president used that, like, it's not beyond the realms of possibility.